Hey, I understand the lighting is not quite as ideal, but I promised I would at least start to record the next segment of our going through the Anarchist Handbook while I was at the annual Labor Day camping trip that we do for LPCO, since I would have some downtime while people are still hanging out at the campfire. And that also explains, because we're up in the mountains, why I'm dressed in such warm winter weather, even though I am in the camper with the heater that comes on occasionally. This is going to be a long section. Probably won't finish it all during this trip, but maybe I will. Plus, as you can see, we're in a really cramped pop-up camper. I've got 2 dogs sleeping on my legs. So, yeah, this isn't the most comfortable position. But let's see what we can get done, shall we? So this is Chapter 8, Lysander Spooner, from No Treason, Number 4, The Constitution of No Authority, which was written in 1870. And I'm just the hugest Lysander Spooner fan now. So the introduction that Michael Malice gives is abolitionist, an attorney. Lysander Spooner's essay, No Treason, consisted of 3 parts. It is the 3rd part, oddly numbered as 6, that holds the most sway today. So it looks like that's strange, because up top it says it's numbered 4, but down here it says it's numbered 6. I think there's a typo in this book. The Constitution is like a no-guns zone sign for conservatives, and that the only people it would bind are those who are already generally honest and peaceable. The ones who would lie or commit harm would simply look at the piece of paper and scoff, or as we would say today, go, LOL, okay. With unrelenting logic, Spooner dissects the sanctity of the Constitution and demonstrates that it cannot be said to have moral authority over anyone. And this was in 1870, so here we start. The Constitution has no inherent authority or obligation. It has no authority or obligation at all unless as a contract between man and man, and it does not so much as even purport to be a contract between persons now existing. It purports at most to be only a contract between persons living 80 years ago. And how many, you just heard the heater come on, how many more years ago now is that? 150? So we're talking, in other words, it can only purport to, and it doesn't even try to, but at best, it can only purport to be a contract for people over 2 centuries ago. It says, and the Constitution, so far it was their contract, died with them. Agreed. Now, obviously, I recommend reading this whole essay, but we're doing the best of, Legally speaking, therefore, there is in the Constitution nothing that professes or attempts to bind the posterity of those who established it. If then those who established the Constitution had no power to bind and did not attempt to bind their posterity, the question arises whether their posterity have bound themselves, and if they have done so, they can have done so in only one or both of these 2 ways, vis-a-vis by voting and by paying taxes. And he goes on to dismantle that. No one by voting can be said to pledge himself for any longer period than that for which he votes. If, for example, I vote for an officer who is to hold office only for a year, I cannot said to thereby pledge myself to support the government beyond that term. Therefore, on the ground of actual voting, it probably cannot be said that more than 1/9 or 1/8 of the whole population are under any pledge to support the Constitution. Remember, back then there was not women's suffrage, and also not all men got to vote either. So much less people back then. But even and so, he's saying, best case circumstance, it's only the people who actually vote, and he doesn't agree with that either, but he's kind of doing an Iron Man or strong man of the argument. He says, in truth, in the case of individuals, their actual voting is not to be taken as proof of consent, even for the time being. On the contrary, it is to be considered that without his consent having been asked, a man finds himself environed by a government that he cannot resist, a government that forces him to pay money, render service, and forego the exercise of many of his natural rights, under peril of weighty punishments. He sees, too, that other men practice this tyranny over him by the use of the ballot. He sees further that if he will but use the ballot himself, he has some chance of relieving himself from this tyranny of others by subjecting them to his own. In short, he finds himself without his consent, so situated that if he uses the ballot, he may become a master. If he does not use it, he must become a slave. And he has no other alternative other than these two. In self-defense, he attempts the former. His case is analogous to that of a man who has... And yes, I got cut off suddenly yesterday when Wayne wanted to come to bed into the trailer, and probably get cut off suddenly again when it's time to go into town. But where we left off was his case, and sorry for the background hum, that's our water pump, I think, going off in the background. And there goes the heater. So it says his case is analogous to that of a man who has been forced into battle, where he must kill others or be killed himself, because to save his own life in battle, a man attempts to take the lives of his opponents. Hear the popping. It is not to be inferred that the battle is one of his own choosing, neither in contest with the ballot, which is a mere substitute for the bullet. Wow, this is super powerful. Because, as his only chance of self-preservation, a man uses a ballot, it is to be inferred that the contest is one into which he voluntarily entered, that he voluntarily set up all his own natural rights as a stake against those of others, to be lost or won by the mere power of numbers. On the contrary, it is to be considered that in an exigency into which he had been forced by others, and in which no other means of self-defense offered, he, as a matter of necessity, used the only one that was left to him. Very wordy. That's the way old-timey writing was. It probably could have been said a lot more, with more brevity, with a lot more conciseness. It says, as we can have no legal knowledge as to who votes from choice and who from the necessity thus forced upon him, we can have no legal knowledge as to any particular individual, that he voted from choice, or consequently, that by voting he consented or pledged himself to support the government. Legally speaking, therefore, the act of voting utterly fails to pledge anyone to support the government. It utterly fails to prove that the government rests upon the voluntary support of anyone. On general principles of law and reason, it cannot be said that the government has any voluntary supporters at all, until it can be distinctly shown who its voluntary supporters are. So true. I feel like I got we had some grainy tooth polish, I still have a grain floating around. This is camping for you. Okay, let's see where else we went. The light in here is not so great. And it is daytime, it's just really dim. We're under a bunch of trees. So it says, the ostensible supporters of the Constitution, like the ostensible supporters of most other governments, are made up of three classes. One, knaves, a numerous and active class who see in the government an instrument which they can use for their own aggrandizement or wealth. Two, dupes, a large class, no doubt, each of whom, because he is allowed one choice out of millions in deciding what he may do with his own person and his own property, and because he is permitted to have the same voice in robbing and enslaving and murdering others that others have in robbing, enslaving, and murdering himself, is stupid enough to imagine that he is a free man, a sovereign. That is, that this is a free government, a government of equal rights, the best government on earth, and such other absurdities. And then number three, a class who have some appreciation of the evils of government, but either do not see how to get rid of them, or do not choose to so far sacrifice their private interests as to give themselves seriously and earnestly to the work of making a change. Doesn't it seem to be a fourth class that would do those things that were not being done in 3? But okay, I'm not sure I even know of any of those people. I think all of us capitulate because we're not on a suicide mission. And he argues these points at some length and ends with, these facts are all so vital and so self-evident that it cannot reasonably suppose that anyone will voluntarily pay money to a government for the purpose of securing its protection unless he first makes an explicit and purely voluntary contract with it for that purpose. So he went through the whole paying taxes isn't consent either. It is perfectly evident, therefore, that neither voting nor such payment of taxes as actually takes place proves anybody's consent or obligation to support the Constitution. Consequently, we have no evidence at all that the Constitution is binding upon anyone or that anyone is under any contract or obligation whatever to support it. Okay. His argument against taxation kind of followed the same flow as his argument against voting being consent, but he goes off on some rabbit trails, and that's why I didn't really include much from that, and saying that you can't really even know the identity of who the government is. I didn't find that particular part of his argument to be persuasive. I do think the part that it's all done under coercion is the most persuasive part, and that was covered adequately under the voting portion. It says, thus the Constitution provides that for any speech or debate or vote in either house, the senator or representative shall not be questioned in any other place. Interesting. It says, a man is nonetheless a slave because he is allowed to choose a new master once in a term of years. Neither are a people any less slaves because permitted periodically to choose new masters. What makes them slaves is the fact that they now are, and are always hereafter to be, in the hands of men whose power over them, and is always to be, absolute and irresponsible. Therefore, if Congress have that absolute and irresponsible lawmaking power, which the Constitution, according to their interpretation of it, gives them, it can only be because they own us as property. If they own us as property, they are our masters, and their will is our law. If they do not own us as property, they are not our masters, and their will, as such, is of no authority to us. For still another reason, they are neither our servants, agents, attorneys, or representatives. And that reason is that we do not make ourselves responsible for their acts. And that is a point that is not brought up nearly enough. If a man is my servant, agent, or attorney, I necessarily make myself responsible for all his acts done within the limits of the power I've entrusted to him. And I don't think many of us want to be responsible for the atrocities that are committed by the state. And so he says it therefore follows that a man has the same right to resist them and their agents that he has to resist any other trespassers. It is plain then, on general principles of law and reason, such principles as we all act upon in courts of justice and in common life, the Constitution is no contract, that it binds nobody and never did bind anybody, and that all those who pretend to act by its authority are really acting without any legitimate authority at all, that on general principles of law and reason they are mere usurpers, and that everyone not only has the right, but is morally bound to treat them as such. If the people of this country wish to maintain such a government as the Constitution describes, there is no reason in the world why they should not sign the instrument itself, and thus make known their wishes in an open, authentic manner, in such manner as the common sense and experience of mankind has shown to be reasonable and necessary in such cases, and to such manner as to make themselves, as they ought to do, individually responsible for the acts of the government. So yes, in conclusion, as you can see, one more change of outfit. It is later in the day. That finishes that section. We're going to move on to the next few chapters. The next few which I've already started, are relatively short, and we're going to end with Benjamin Tucker. But the next few are ones about which I don't have much in common. So chapter 9 and chapter 10 are super short, but they have to do with anarchists who didn't mind using violent ends. Obviously, I'm going to skim over those and just give you a super brief summary. When these videos eventually go up on YouTube, I don't want to be promoting or even have the hint of promoting any kind of violence, which I absolutely do not. And the last one, Benjamin Tucker, which is the one we'll end on, is comparing and contrasting anarchist socialism with state socialism. And that's what I'm in the middle of reading right now. And all of those will be in the next segment. Okay, we're back, still on the camping trip. I'm waiting in the truck as we're getting ready to go home. I've got these older glasses that got like scratch marks across the lenses. I don't know if you can see, and that's what I've been actually reading with because I lost the other pair of glasses. This big bulky coat on. It makes it look like I have a tiny head. But let's do a little bit more. As I said, the next few chapters are from those who advocated violence, which, you know, I'm definitely not down with. So I'll just give you a little overview and we'll go on to ones that I think are more productive and edifying. So this one is Johann Most, and basically was a bomb maker. So yeah, I think that's all we're going to say about that. Yeah, I didn't even underline anything in here because that's just not my thing. The next one is Louis Lang. And I am going to read a little bit about this because this is one of the people who were hanged for being anarchist in somewhere in the late 1800s in Chicago. So it says,